In 1629, the Dutch United East India Company's brand new return ship, the Batavia, had crashed on a reef off the coast of Australia, leaving hundreds of passengers and crew stranded on the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands with little food and water. Meanwhile, the ship's upper merchant, Francisco Pelsaert, and Captain Adriaan Jacobszoon managed to reach VOC headquarters on Java in a longboat, along with 46 other survivors. They had to tell the man in charge of the VOC in the east, Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koen, that they had lost the ship with valuable cargo and left the survivors behind. They hoped that he would organize a rescue mission to save the people and salvage the goods. The survivors were stranded on something they called Batavia's graveyard. The undermerchant Hieronymus Corneliszoon, a former apothecary, represented the VOC on the island. He had organized the people, the goods, and the supplies. But he also continued that mutiny that he'd been planning with Captain Jacobs and a whole bunch of crew on the Batavia before she crashed. He now intended to seize a rescue ship once it arrived and use it to go pirating. For this purpose, he had gathered a bunch of brutal men around him. He had been shipping groups of people to different islands to die, but still too many remained on the main island who could ruin their plans. They had to go. He just needed to wait for the right opportunity. One month after the Batavia wrecked on the Abrolhos Islands, one of the gunners on Batavia's graveyard, Abraham Hendricks, was caught stealing wine from one of the barrels in the supply tent. After some interrogation, Hendricks implicated a fellow gunner, Adriaan Adriaanszoon. He had given him some wine to drink as well. Hieronymus called the council together. According to company rules, both men should be put to death. He argued that they had to lay down the law and show that VOC property would be protected at all costs. The council wasn't sure. Maybe Hendricks deserved it, but not Adriaans for only drinking what Hendricks stole. Hieronymus was outraged. How can you not let this happen? Nevertheless, you will soon have to resolve on something quite else. The others got worried. What did he mean by that? The following morning, Hieronymus called the survivors on Batavia's graveyard together. He announced that since the council members refused to maintain law, order, and stability on the island, they were dismissed. They were replaced with Koenraad van Huysen, David Zeevank, and stonecutter Pieters. Ah yes, the top dog mutineers, of course. The ousted councillors were apparently too afraid to speak up, because they did nothing. The newly appointed councillors brought swift justice on the two criminals, off with their heads. But wait, there was more. Rumor had it that Egbert Roelofs and Warnar Dirks were planning to steal one of the two yawls that the carpenters had built from the ship's remains. It was just gossip, but the new council took it as fact. For endangering the lives of all the people on Batavia's graveyard, they should also be put to death. Daniel Corneliszoon and Hans Frederikszoon were the appointed executioners. They had to prove that they were true mutineers. Daniel has pierced the aforesaid Warnar with his sword, of which he boasted later, saying that it went through him as easily as butter, and Hans Frederiks has let himself be used very willingly and has also given 2 or 3 hacks to Warnar. Egbert and Abraham were killed quickly after that. Adriaan Adriaans appeared to have escaped somehow. He will show up again later. That night, Hieronymus got his mutineers smash-faced drunk and started preaching his libertine beliefs. God was good, and he created all things. A good God could not have created demons or hell, so they didn't exist. All thoughts they had came from God, and were pure and good. That's why there were no consequences for their actions some might consider to be unnatural. Here was the truth. There were too many mouths to feed. If any one of the mutineers wanted to have a chance to survive, more people had to die. They would spare the useful ones. The troublemakers had to go. And God was fine with it. Besides, Pelsaert had ordered him to do it. Later that day, Hieronymus once again gathered everyone on Batavia's graveyard. He made an announcement. Some men had to go help Wibbe in his search for water on the high island. And everyone was like, "Great plan, boss!" There were many volunteers this time, and Hieronymus picked 4. Zeevank took the chief mutineers and soldier Hendrik Jans van Oldenburg, sailor Thomas Wenzel from Copenhagen, Jan Cornelis from Amersfoort, and company cadet Andries Liebend with their personal effects out on the yawl to the high island. The moment they were out of Batavia's graveyard's line of sight, the mutineers grabbed the 4 volunteers and tied them up by their hands and feet. One by one, they were chucked into the water to drown. When it was Liebend's turn, he begged he would do anything to spare his life. Zeevank figured he would make a good mutineer, but he had to swear allegiance to Hieronymus the moment they got back. Liebend agreed. When the mutineers returned, Zeevank told everyone that Wibbe and his men were doing great. There was lots of food and more people could come over. No one asked why Liebend had returned with them. A day later, 3 more lucky ducks were sent to the high island with Zeevank and his band of villains. They were Cadet Hans Radder, the upper trumpeter Jacob Groenewald, and the VOC clerical assistant Andries de Vries. Matthias Beer had been a real enemy of Hans Radder and Jacob Groenewald and had hated them very much, and therefore had requested Hieronymus to consent that he should murder them because they were loose-tongued. The yawl once again disappeared from the island's view and Radder and Groenewald were tied up and drowned. De Vries was last to go and begged for his life. He would do anything at all. Zeevank was like, "Do you want to play a game?" He was a mouth to feed, but if he eliminated more mouths, he'd be an asset. Once back on the island, De Vries had to swear an oath of allegiance to Hieronymus and get ready to do some killing. 8 people down, dozens more to go. The Reverend Gijsbert Bastiaanszoon noticed that the men in Hieronymus' circle had started swearing and cursing up a storm. This was a flogging offense on board, but worse, the undermerchant was encouraging them. Every day, the Reverend held a church service for the survivors. The mutineers made fun of him and wanted to sing sailor songs instead of hymns. Hendricks had already told him to stop preaching by Hieronymus' orders. The Reverend ignored him. Then one day, when he prayed to God to keep them under his wings for protection, a few mutineers behind the Reverend held severed seals flippers over their heads. They mocked the Reverend. "Look, old man, we're already beneath the wings." Others said that they had enough seals meat and no longer needed to pray. Outraged, the Reverend went to Hieronymus to complain about the blasphemy. The undermerchant informed him that he had issued an edict. Religious services were declared useless. All their time should be spent surviving, not praying for survival. The Reverend was shocked and angry, but too afraid to do anything about it. Of the 22 women on board, only a few were left on Batavia's graveyard. The older and pregnant wives had been sent away, leaving the younger, prettier ones. This was not a coincidence. The sailors and soldiers hadn't slept with women in months, and now Hieronymus allowed them to have their way with a few of the unprotected women who were alone without a husband. If any of the women selected for service refused to cooperate in any way, they were told they would die. Treintje Frederiksdochter's husband, Klaas Janszoon, had left with the longboat. Now she and her sister Zussie no longer had a protector. They were the first to be forced into public service. Marretje Lowijs was the third unlucky one that the men could sexually abuse at their leisure. Anneken Boschieter, the wife of Jan Karstenszoon, was also unprotected. Her husband had conveniently been shipped off to the high island to go find water with Hayes, but she managed to keep the horny men at arm's length, for now. Anneken Harden still had her husband Hans to protect her, but even with her 6-year-old daughter Hilletje clinging to her, she became a target. The couple decided that Anneken would do what she had to do to save her family, and she entered into public service, for which now 2 tents were built. Hieronymus felt that as king of the island, he was entitled to a concubine. Only Lucretia would do. She was brought to the undermerchant's tent and was told to stay there. It was for her own protection. Euronymous would keep her safe, and she could even sleep in his bed, the only one on the island with pillows and sheets. Naturally, Euronymous would sleep right next to her, and they could keep each other warm, if you catch my meaning. Lucretia was like, ew. She slept on a mat on the floor instead. Euronymous was not happy. Koenraad van Huysen, next to the undermerchant, Zeevank and Stonecutter, the most powerful man on the island, felt too good and important for the communal women. If the undermerchant had Lucretia all to himself, he wanted a woman all to himself. He had set his sights on 21-year-old Judith, the eldest daughter of the Reverend. She was pretty and womanly and a bit of a prude, but that was not a turn-off for Van Huysen. Judith swore that she would rather die than be with a man out of holy matrimony. Van Huysen was like, that can be arranged. Judith knew he was not joking. He told her he would marry her once they got back to civilization. The marriage, however, had to be consummated immediately. The family discussed the awful deal put before them. If Judith refused, the entire family would be in danger. Besides, being with one man, as horrible as he may be, would at least save her from public service. Judith resigned to her fate and was immediately escorted to Van Huysen's tent without being given even more than a moment to say goodbye to her family. Pelsart and the survivors of the longboat had at last arrived at the VOC headquarters in Batavia on Java. If the upper merchant had kept himself alive at the thought of hanging out at the city taverns and living it up at the whorehouses of Batavia, he was in for a disappointment. The town was still in ruins after the 3-month siege by Sultan Agung of the Mataram Empire 7 months earlier. Governor General Koen had been forced to burn most of the place to the ground. What was worse, Batavia was preparing to fend off a second attack expected in about a month. Seeing all this, Upper Merchant Pelsart and Captain Jacobs both feared Koen's mood. They had to tell him that a brand new return ship and 400,000 guilders of trade goods was wrecked on a reef, and about 250 people were left stranded, including the 100 soldiers that could have beefed up the garrison to defend Batavia against another attack from the Javanese. All merchants knew that a small portion of the cargo could be lost along the way, but an entire ship? Explain that one to dear old Uncle Koen, the most ruthless man ever to serve the VOC. Their careers and even lives were in the hands of a man who could never forgive misdeeds even when they resulted from understandable human weakness, and whose heart was never softened by the sufferings of his opponents. Just last month, the Governor General had demonstrated how ruthless he could be. He had Sarah Spex flogged in front of the town hall for the crime of making love in her room at the governor's apartments. Sarah was the 12-year-old half-Japanese daughter of VOC Fleet Commander Jacques Spex. Her lover was Peter Kortenhoef, the 15-year-old nephew of the town clerk. The fiscal and the councillors of the Indies had begged Koen to show compassion. There was evidence that the intercourse was consensual and the lovers wished to marry, but the Governor-General had remained unmoved. Their act had disgraced the Dutch reputation in Javanese eyes, who found out about it from the slaves that had given the boy access to the girl's room. Koen had the boy beheaded, and was only narrowly prevented from having Sarah drowned. The skipper and the commodore realized if Koen did that to a 12-year-old girl, what would he do to them? Pelsart was called into Koen's office the next day. The Governor-General had been briefed, and he was none too pleased. The meeting lasted for 2 hours, with Pelsart explaining everything. Koen himself had had a close encounter with the reef back in his sailing days, when his captain had miscalculated the distance to land by 900 miles. But that had been in broad daylight. He could only imagine that nighttime made it worse. He was tough, but fair, and he didn't criticize the commodore's action. But Pelsart had to explain everything to the Council of the Indies the next day, and they would decide what to do next. Euronymous got all dressed up for a dinner party. He had started wearing different outfits each day. He had collected clothes that had been fished out of the water and taken possession of Pelsart's expensive cloaks. The undermerchant had started rationing the food, giving himself and his mutineers the best. He invited Hans and Anneken Hardens to a lavish dinner, while the rest of the survivors were half-starved. Hieronymus had told them that they couldn't bring their 6-year-old daughter Hilletje along for some reason. After dinner was over, the couple thanked Hieronymus for his hospitality and left. Moments later, a bone-chilling scream rang out in Batavia's graveyard's air. The couple found blood on the floor of their tent. Their daughter Hilletje was gone. The undermerchant had lured them away long enough for Jan Hendricks to carry out his order to stab the kid to death and dispose of the body. A shockwave went through the island. They had killed an innocent child. What was happening? Hans got the message. You were either with them or against them. He joined the mutineers a few days later and was immediately separated from his wife. Smoke, and more smoke, and a third column of smoke rose from one of the high islands. 20 days after having been dropped off, Wiebe Hayes and his men found water. The non-mutineers rejoiced. The time for meager rations was over. Hieronymus was less than thrilled. The soldiers were still alive, and now they had found water? That was a problem. On Trader's Island, the smoke signal couldn't have come at a better time. All 14 people jumped into action. They had managed to survive, but only just. They had drunk the water from any brackish pool of rainwater they could find, as well as the blood and the flesh of the sea lions that they managed to kill. The provost had known something was off when the supplies the undermerchant had promised them never came. He had ordered 2 rafts to be built out of sight of Batavia's graveyard. The provost divvied up the 14 people and launched 2 half-finished rafts. They got through the shallows and into the deep gully, rowing toward High Island as fast as they could. Those on Batavia's graveyard could now see them. Hieronymus had a 30-second council meeting, and they decided that these people couldn't join Team Hayes. Hieronymus told Zeevank slaat dood. Kill them. Zeevank gathered Van Huysen, Van Welderen, Hendricks, Leonard Michels, Lucas Gelles, a young cadet from The Hague, and Cornelis Pieters, a common soldier from Utrecht. This was all the yawl could carry. The rafts made it a mile out from the island when Team Trader's Island saw the mutineers coming straight at them with swords out. The yawl was faster than the rafts, but the provost and his people continued to paddle. What else could they do? The mutineers caught up with them and attacked. Some jumped onto the rafts. Using their oars as defense, the provost and the men tried to deflect the swords. The mutineers killed the provost, his child, the Patoy's child, and 2 other men. 4 more men were forced to jump into the water. Even though they couldn't swim, they drowned. 4 men and 3 women were all that was left of Team Trader's Island. Zeevank ordered them to row to Batavia's graveyard. They did. When they arrived, they were told to wait, while Zeevank consulted with Hieronymus. One of the mutineers stood in the water, holding the rafts. Others were still on them. The 2 sailors, Pauwels Barends and Bessel Jans, and the 2 soldiers, Klaas Harmenszoon and Nicolaas Winkelhaak, jumped off the rafts into the water. They swam to the shore, begging the undermerchant who stood on the beach for protection. Hieronymus looked down on the desperate men at his feet and said, "Give them no quarter," and ordered Jan Hendricks and Frederiks to kill them. Hendricks jumped off the raft and ran up the beach behind the men, sword in hand. He lunged at Pauwels, cutting his side open. The sailor fell backward onto the sand, and Andries Jonas at 40, the oldest mutineer, drove a pike through Barends' throat and pinned him down until he died. Hendricks slashed at Winkelhaak and wounded Bessel Jans. Locksmith Frederiks joined in the fun, striking the mentioned Bessel with his sword until he was dead. Then the locksmith alone slew Harmenszoon as he fled back through the shallows. It left the 3 women on the rafts, Pieters' wife, Harmens' wife, and Claudine Patoy's. It appeared they were safe, because Zeevank, Van Huysen and Van Welderen sheathed their swords, got back into their yawl, and towed the raft back out to sea. Once in the deep channel, they pushed the women into the water and watched them drown. Team Trader's Island was dead. Sooner than he had wanted, Hieronymus had shown his hand. He was a stone-cold killer. Though the survivors outnumbered Euronymous' men 4-1, they were stunned into inaction. They were aware that the apothecary controlled all the weapons on the island, and only his followers had access to the swords, daggers, and axes in the stores. The island was small and barren. There was nowhere to hide. The boats were always guarded, so unless they could swim, and most couldn't, the survivors couldn't escape either. Besides, the undermerchant was the VOC. If anyone defied him, it would be considered a mutiny against the company, and they'd be killed. Over the next few days, a dozen or so men swore allegiance to Euronymous. Maybe they wanted to save themselves, get better rations, or have access to the women. The mutineers no longer had to hide what they were doing. They started parading around the island, terrorizing everyone, shouting things like, "Who wants to get hit in the head?" The Reverend remembered, "So we all of us together expected to be murdered at any moment, and we beseeched God continuously for merciful relief. O cruelty, O atrocity of atrocities, they proved themselves nothing more than highwaymen. Murderers who are on the roads often take their belongings from people, but they sometimes leave them their lives, but these have taken both, goods and blood." Team Seals Island had witnessed the whole ghastly affair of the elimination of Team Traders Island. They quickly built their own rafts now. Their best chance of survival was to make it to Team Hyas. On Hyas Island, because that's what we're calling it now, Wiebe Hyas and his parched crew had chanced on 2 fresh water wells under some rocks. But after lighting the bonfires, nothing happened. No one came their way, and the smoke from Traders Island was gone. What was happening? On Monday morning, Pelsart faced the Council of the Indies and Fiscaal Anthony van den Heuvel in Batavia's Citadel's massive conference room, alone. Captain Adriaan Jacobs wasn't there, probably because Pelsart had said a few damning things about the skipper during his talk with Koen. There were 8 seats on the council, but there were 6 vacancies at this time. In fact, in a few months, a letter would arrive from the 17 board members of the company to recommend Koen to appoint Pelsart as a new member of this council. It would be another year before the 17 heard about the wreck. The 2 members weren't exactly impartial. Pieter Vlak was Koen's brother-in-law. Antonio van Diemen was a bankrupt man who had fled to the Indies. Koen had spared him from the 17's wrath because the man had a very special set of skills. Pelsart was severely questioned about the whole affair. For a chance to save his career, he convinced the council that there was hope. The most precious trade goods had been landed on the island. The men decided not to punish him. Yet, his role in the wrecking of the Batavia would come under investigation. But for now, he could redeem himself by returning to the wreck as quickly as possible to retrieve the company's precious cargo. And the people, of course. Yeah, the people too. Sure. It was put forward by His Honor Koen to the council that since it was apparent that it was possible that some of the people and also some of the goods might be saved and salvaged, they should be sent thither with a suitable yacht. And it was found good to dispatch the Saardam to provide the same with provision, water, extra cables and anchors, and to send back thither Francisco Pelsart, commandeur of the wrecked ship Batavia, in order to dive for the goods, with the express order to return hither as soon as possible, after having done everything for the saving of the people and the salvaging of the goods and cash, so that the company may receive some recompense to balance its great loss. Koen gave the commandeur pretty straightforward instructions, but it was riddled with veiled threats. Don't fail us a second time. Pelsart should be prepared to spend 3, 4 or more months at the wreck site, however long it took to complete salvage operations. He wasn't supposed to give up too quickly if the weather made it impossible to dive at the wreck site. If the weather got really bad, the upper merchants should establish a temporary base on the Southland. In case they didn't find any survivors, he should check the Southland for any signs of them. Within reason, of course. Pelsart's #1 priority, and his only obligation to the company, was to salvage the cash. Failure to carry out these orders would not be tolerated. The upper merchant's honor was at stake. He was also ordered to take extensive notes and keep a perfect journal. He had to write down, among other things, all the islands, rocks, and reefs he saw underway and their exact coordinates. Pelsard started planning immediately. It would take a week to get the Saardam ready to sail. They had to fix things, clean her hull, resupply, and install a skipper and a skeleton crew. As few people as possible would go with him, so they could fit as many survivors on the ship as possible. Pelsard brought 6 divers, 2 Dutch and 4 from the Indian state of Gujarat, to retrieve the money boxes from the seafloor. If Pelsard could just secure these money chests, everything would be fine. Koen added, "And don't forget the chest of jewels that you brought onto the little island with the people before you took your leave. And bring it here." Zeevank had spared Andries de Vries from being thrown overboard after the assistant promised he would do anything to save his life. Time had come to play that little game. Hieronymus called de Vries to his tent. He had to prove he was one of the mutineers or else die. The undermerchant told him that various people were lying ill in their little huts. They were useless. Worse than useless, they were mouths to feed. If de Vries could be a deer and kill them all, please, pretty please. De Vries had no choice but to comply. One more thing. Hieronymus had seen de Vries talking to Lucretia on her short walks outside. If it happened again, he would rip out his guts. Savvy? De Vries swore that he would never speak to Lucretia again. That night, Hieronymus, Zeevank, Van Huysen and Van Welderen guided de Vries to the various tents. Zeevank gave the assistant a knife and instructed him on how best to cut the patients' throats. When he was done, de Vries had killed 11 people. John Pinton, an English soldier, hadn't been seen in a while. When Zeevank went to check it out, he found him sick in bed. Hieronymus called for gunner Allard Jans and his favorite bloodhound Jan Hendricks. Take care of it. The duo went over to the Englishman's tent, where Allard Jans plunged the dagger in Pinton's throat, ending his life. Now the mere act of becoming ill was a crime, punishable by death. Only 2 invalids were spared. They were friends of the mutineers, Hans Frederiks, who had already helped to execute 1 man, and Olivier van Welderen, Gijsbert's older brother. On Hayes Island, Wiebe had kept the beacons lit for 2 days, but no one was coming. He could tell there were still survivors out there. Smoke was coming from 2 islands. How very strange. More mutineers joined the dark side. They had cookies and clothes, food, wine, and women. To be fair, their only alternative was to be next on the hit list. But the mutineers were still outnumbered, and had the survivors had a leader, they could have easily orchestrated a coup. Hieronymus was upset about a few things. Lucretia was still resisting him and his charms. Hayes and his men were still alive and well on the high island. But worse than all that, Hieronymus became painfully aware that he was surrounded by armed, ruthless men, while he had no military skills at all. His only weapon to keep the men in line was his silver tongue. Especially men like Koenraad van Huysen and David Zeevank were major threats. They were self-confident, if junior, noblemen. Back then that meant something, even if they were dirt poor. Zeevank orchestrated and led many of the killing sprees, and Van Huysen was a hothead and difficult to keep in check. Likely, this was the reason that Hieronymus had allowed Van Huysen to have exclusive rights to Judik. Had he refused the request, who knows what would have happened. Once they realized that the undermerchant hadn't killed anyone himself yet, and that he was essentially weak and powerless, they could kill him and take over the mutiny. The apothecary did everything he could to bind the mutineers to him. He told them that all restrictive rules and laws of old were cancelled. To alleviate any guilt that the murderers might be feeling, he preached daily about the heretical beliefs of the spiritual libertines. Everything a person did was given into his heart by God, no matter if others judged it to be good or bad. God was perfect in virtue and goodness and would not be able to send evil or bad thoughts into a man's heart because God had no evil or badness in him. Hieronymus then decided to create a brotherhood of blood, a tightly controlled circle of murderers that would swear allegiance to each other and to him. Each of the signees would have to prove their worth by committing whatever murders and brutalities were asked of him. Once the soul was corrupted, the rest was easy. Kill once, kill again. And once everyone was a murderer, they wouldn't testify against each other. But these were Dutch people who needed to put everything in writing. So Hieronymus had Salomon Deschamps, Pelsart's notary, draft up a contract. Every one of the 25 mutineers had to sign it. We, the undersigned, in order to take away all the distrust that exists or might arise amongst us, bind ourselves herewith on the salvation of our souls and on the solemn oath that God shall truly help us to be true to each other in everything and to love each other as brothers, also promising not to do each other any injury whatsoever in person or possession without first declaring verbally to each other the breach of the peace, in knowledge whereof we have signed this contract on the 12th of July 1629 on the island Batavia's Kerkhof. If any man broke the bond they'd just sworn to, they would be put to death. To celebrate, they each drank wine from a golden goblet. Back to the Hunger Games. Anyone who didn't turn to the dark side and refused to join the mutiny should be killed post-haste. Carpenter Jacob Hendricks, gunner Paschier van den Ende, and a sick boy were in their tent when they heard footsteps approach. They stopped at their tent. Zeevang, carrying a lamp, had led Leonard Michels, Lucas Jellis, and Jan Hendricks there. Jan went into their tents and asked Paschier if he had any goods hidden there. He answered weepingly no, and begged that he might be allowed to say his prayers because he thought that it would cost him his life. But Zeevang said, "Get on with it." Thus Hendricks threw him to the ground and cut his throat. Carpenter Jacob, seeing his tent buddy bleeding out, bitterly begged for his life. Zeevang checked in with Hieronymus to ask if the man's life shouldn't be spared. The man was a carpenter, and he might be useful to them. Hieronymus disagreed. He was only a turner, and lame to boot. Besides, he might start talking to the authorities later. It was a death sentence. They would leave no witnesses. Michel sat on Jacob's body, and Hendrik started stabbing the carpenter with 2 knives. But he missed the heart. One of his knives splintered, and the other snapped on the bone. Jellis handed him one of his knives. Hendrik stabbed Jacob's throat, but that knife also broke. He could not bring him to death, so that at last he cut his throat with a piece of the blade. After that he did likewise to the boy. The 3 bodies were quickly buried. Batavia's graveyard was turning into a proper graveyard. The mutineers split the men's property between them. Meanwhile, the Batavia HQ soldiers arrested the Batavia's crew leader, the high boatswain Jan Evertsson. He was thrown in the stinking dungeon beneath the Batavia citadel and held for questioning. Everts was accused of the attack on Lucretia, a crime according to company regulations. He was interrogated by either the advocaat-fiscaal, the public prosecutor Anthony van den Heuvel, or one of his associates. If Everts denied Pelsart's claims and they didn't believe him, he would have been tortured to get at the truth. Torture was a perfectly legal interrogation tool under Dutch law, but any confessions made during torture had to be repeated voluntarily once the accused returned to his senses. Only a free will confession counted. If someone recanted their confession, they'd be tortured again, allowed to recover again. Rinse and repeat. It would take a lot to convince an interrogator of your innocence, and in the meantime, you'd suffer. Apparently, Everts confessed to the very great insolences, yea, monstrous actions that were committed on the mentioned ship and appeared to have implicated Jacobs. He apparently never talked about the mutiny, nor Hieronymus' involvement in it. Captain Jacobs was also arrested, thrown in the dungeon, and interrogated. He was charged with 2 things. Because Adriaan Jacobs, skipper of the wrecked Batavia, is notorious through allowing himself to be blown away by pure neglect, and also because through his doings a gross evil and public assault has taken place on the same ship, it has been decided by His Honor Koen and the Council to arrest the mentioned skipper and bring him to trial here in order that he may answer those accusations made to his detriment. Jacobs was not tortured, however, perhaps due to his rank, or because the prosecutor wasn't convinced of his guilt. In fact, the evidence against him appeared so flimsy that no one knew what to do with him. They decided to ask the 17 back in the Netherlands for advice. There was no question that Jacobs was responsible for the faulty navigations that wrecked the Batavia. As the officer on watch that night, he was doubly accountable. Even if they never believed he was involved with Lucretia's assault, the wrecking of the ship was enough to keep him in a cell. At least until the 17 back home had reached the verdict. It would take about a year for a message to reach Amsterdam and another year to receive an answer from the 17. Jacobs was gonna be there for a while. Andries de Vries had killed 11 people, and he was traumatized. But he was still forced to play the game. 4 more people had fallen ill, and Hieronymus, Zeevank and Van Huysen showed de Vries the tents where the patients lay. He killed them. The next day, he had to kill again. Hieronymus himself came and called Beer out of his tent and has said, "Go get Hendrik Klaas of Apkouw, carpenter, out of his tent and say he has to come to me. And when he comes outside, you, with the help of de Vries, must cut his throat," which they together have done. De Vries was losing his mind. He tried to talk to Lucretia, which Hieronymus had forbidden him to do on pain of death. De Vries stood far away from her, as not to arouse suspicion. Still, Zeevank saw what he was doing and snitched to Hieronymus. The under-merchant called Rutger Frederiks, Jan Hendriks and Lennart Michels to his tent. The men were given a beaker of wine and a sword each. At noon, in front of all the people on the island, the trio calmly walked up to the assistant. De Vries knew they were coming for him and tried to save himself. When De Vries saw his life was forfeit, he fled into the water, but Lennart, following him the quickest, chiefly hacked him to death. It was a public execution. The mutineers had now killed over 50 men, women and children, a third of whom were too little or too ill to put up a fight. Of the 90 people left on Batavia's graveyard, nearly half were mutineers, or associates. The easiest thing one could do to survive was to join the gang. Surgeon Frans Jans had now seen what Hieronymus was capable of and joined the dark side. Hieronymus would have welcomed the educated man at his table, but he would also have kept a close eye on him. Educated men were potentially dangerous. Aris Jans, the other surgeon of the Batavia, showed absolutely no interest in joining the mutineers. He could become a problem. Finally, the Saardam was cleaned, fixed, packed, staffed, and ready to leave Batavia to go look for the wreck and retrieve the company property. And rescue the people, of course. It had taken the longboat 30 days to get to Batavia. The yacht would sail against the wind, but she was fast. Pelsart hoped they'd get to the wreck by mid-August, a month from now. The Saardam's captain was Jacob Jacobszoon, no relation. We'll call him JJ. He had been the ship's original skipper on the way in. Pelsart and 3 other longboat survivors got on board. Klaas Gerrits, the Batavia's upper steersman, and Jacobs Janszoon Hollert, whose navigational skills were needed to help locate the Abrolhos Island. No one at this time knew exactly where those islands were. The third longboat passenger to come along was Klaas Jans, the upper trumpeter who had to leave his wife Treintje and her sister Zussie on Batavia's graveyard. He couldn't wait to get back there and save them. As the ship left the harbor and made for the Sunda Strait, Pelsart was hopeful that if he retrieved the cargo and the money, he might avoid punishment. His merchant days were probably over. It was high time to get rid of the witnesses so Hieronymus could focus on dealing with Wiebe Hayes and the soldiers on the second high island. Those on Seals Island had to go. The undermerchant hadn't sent any supplies over, but somehow those people were still alive. They had seen what had happened to Team Traitors Island. They could rat him out to the company crew once the rescue ship arrived. Hieronymus told Zeevank and Van Huysen to pick the cream of the killing crop and go to Seals Island. Kill most of the people, children, as well as some men, and leave alive for the time being the women who are there. They shouldn't reveal the plan to the others until they got there. Out came the golden goblet with the wine to seal the deal. Hieronymus sent another man along, the surgeon Frans Jans. He had to prove himself a worthy mutineer and get his hands bloody. Corporal Gabriel Jacobszoon and VOC assistant Cornelis Janszoon had organized the survivors of Seals Island. There were about 12 men, about 24 cabin boys, and 4 pregnant women, some with young children. They'd seen the murder sprees and they knew what they were up against once they saw the yawl leaving Batavia's graveyard. They braced themselves for what was to come. There was no shelter, there were no caves, and there was no means to escape. They were trapped. The mutineers landed and started the chase. All except the surgeon fell on their victims. Leonard immediately after he arrived stabbed one boy right through the body and another through the butt, and also Jacob de Vos Taylor right through his side. And as soon as they have come here, Jan Hendricks has stabbed to death 5 cabin boys and 2 men. After that, he has helped to drag many wounded, who were not yet dead, into the water. One of these men was Corporal Gabriel Jacobs, who was trying to defend his pregnant wife, Laurentia Thomas, and their child. Only a few men were able to fight back, but without weapons. They were powerless against the heavily armed mutineers. The women were spared, but the children were killed quickly. Van Huysen struck VOC assistant Jans with a sword, but his sword was blunt and Van Huysen had to wrestle Jans to the ground. Jans was only lightly wounded and kept hitting Van Huysen. Van Helweg charged in for an assist and drove his pike through Jans. But the pike didn't go through and Jans got to his feet, hitting both Van Huysen and Helweg so hard that he knocked them both to the ground. He then ducked into the bushes where Cornelis, the once fat trumpeter, was hiding out. The killing continued until it got dark. Some cabin boys hid in the bushes and others were so fast that the mutineers couldn't catch them. The solution? Get one of the kids who were just as fast to chase them and make him kill for them. Zeevank knew exactly who to pick for the job. Abraham Gerrits, the kid they had picked up back in Sierra Leone. Holding Abraham at sword point, Zeevank told him, "Boy, you must help lustily to kill or be in a fix yourself." Zeevank handed Abraham a dagger, and the kid went on the hunt. His first victim was a 15-year-old. Seals Island devolved into utter chaos. And in the chaos, the mutineers didn't notice that Assistant Jans with 7 other men, including the once fat trumpeter, slipped away into the water. After witnessing the massacre of Traitors Island, they had constructed makeshift boats out of view of Batavia's graveyard. In the dark, they were invisible as they climbed on board. Any noise they made paddling was drowned out by the shouts and screams from the people being hunted down on the island. Finally, the mutineers stopped. They were done. They had killed 10 men and 6 boys. They drowned another 6 boys who were severely wounded. 4 women, all pregnant, had been spared. 15 kids and 8 men were missing, but they had no hope of finding them in the dark. It didn't matter. They couldn't have gotten very far. It was not like they had rafts or anything. They'd deal with them later. They returned to Batavia's graveyard, having sated their bloodlust, and brought their new recruit, Abraham Gerrits. Team Hayes discovered Team Seals Island assistant Jans lying half-drowned on the beach. They brought him back to camp. Once Jans recovered somewhat, he told the men everything. The soldiers were like, "What the frack?" Hayes was like, "So, that's why no one came for them when they found water. Hieronymus had obviously sent them there to die, and they hadn't died, which meant the undermerchant would go after them. Sooner or later, they should prepare." 6 more Team Seals Island refugees reached Hayes Island. They'd lost 1 man along the way. Over the next few days, at least 5 different groups made the tricky passage across 4 miles of open water. Some were sitting on little homemade rafts or swimming behind planks of wood. Apart from the Seals Island 7, nearly 20 managed to slip away from Batavia's graveyard. One of these men was Arjen Ariens, who had been sentenced to death by the council. And the near-starved newcomers were stunned at the abundance of food and water. The Lord our God fed us so richly that we could have lived here with 10,000 men for 100 years. Birds like doves, we could get 500 in a day, and each bird had an egg as large as a hen's egg. They hunted wallabies, slaughtering 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even more for each person, and found fishing spots where they could haul in 40 fish as large as cod in only an hour. Team Hyas had doubled in size. 46 men and a boy were all well-fed, hydrated, and motivated. They started making weapons, forts, and outposts. They became the Defenders. You may wonder, how could 5 women service 35 mutineers without fights breaking out? They couldn't. Euronymous realized that there were too few women for too many men. It was time for some kind of regulation. He had Salomon draft a new oath to arrange the sleeping arrangements, listing the women available for service. Hans Harden signed this time as well, officially handing over his wife to the men who killed their child. The women had to take an oath as well. Euronymous met with them, one-on-one, and made them swear not only eternal allegiance to him, but to also make their bodies available to whosoever of the mutineers demanded. They had to promise to be obedient to the men in all that they should desire from them, not just in sexual matters. Euronymous, in turn, pledged on his soul and salvation that if they signed, they no longer had to fear getting killed. They would be under his personal protection. From now on, the women were sleeping with the men on a more ordered basis, but the women were now kept busy at all hours of the day and night. The non-mutineers had no sex at all. Some women were spared from service. Maiken Cardoes had a young baby and was often ill. The reverend servant, Wybrecht Klaas, was also safe. She was too butch. The reverend's 14-year-old daughter, Willemijntien, was also left alone. She most likely hadn't hit puberty yet. In this century, children typically didn't hit puberty until they were 16. So there was a line. Judith and Lucretia, being exclusive to Van Huysen and Euronymous respectively, made the other women angry. As the Reverend recalled, "My daughter has been with Van Huysen for about 5 weeks. He has protected her very well, so that no disaster has befallen her, other than that she had to remain with him. The other women were very jealous of her, because they thought that too much honor was accorded her. Everyone thought Lucretia was already servicing Euronymous. Some even started to believe she was the one telling Euronymous to order all the killing. She was doing neither. Euronymous did everything he could think of to get her into bed with him. He was gallant, apologetic, and charming. He tried pleading and even wrote her poems, but she remained unmoved. Euronymous tried anger and resentment. Hadn't he helped her? Wasn't he protecting her? Wasn't she grateful to be saved from the service to the other men? The beauty persisted in her refusal to engage with the beast. Pelgrim got Allard Jans from his tent. He had to go see Euronymous. The undermerchant ordered him to kill Andries de Bruin, a cabin boy. Allard called the boy and said to him, "Andries, we have to go and catch some birds." But when they got to the beach, Allard cut the boy's throat. 3 days after the Seals Island massacre, Euronymous decided the job had to be finished. He hadn't seen a sign of life, but he had been told there were still 4 women, 15 boys, and 8 men left. No one knew that the 8 men had already slipped away, and 7 of them managed to join Team Hyas. Euronymous felt that the 40-year-old soldier Andries Jonas had to get a proper murder under his belt. He was ordered to kill the women. Zeevank has asked Andries Jonas at night, "Have you got a sharp knife on you?" He said, "Certainly I have a knife, but it's not very sharp." Whereupon Zeevank handed him his own knife and said to him, "Cut the throats of the women with it." The other men on Team Mutineers were Van Huysen, Beer, Van Welderen, Jan Willemse Lijns, the upper cooper, and Jan Pelgrom, the cabin boy, who finally got his first chance to pounce. Pelgrom has gone to Seals Island with David Zeevank, who took him with him on his own request because he had heard that the remaining women and children would be murdered. After sundown, the mutineers quietly slipped onto the island. They spotted 4 women huddled around a fire and assumed the cabin boys were asleep in their tents. No sign of the men. They charged. Pelgrom killed a boy. After that, he ran to Janneken Gist, striking her many times with his sword. Andries Jonas had gone to Maiken Soers, who was heavily pregnant, has taken her a little to one side and said to her, "Maiken, love, you must die," and thrown her underfoot and cut her throat. That being done, he saw that Jan Pelgrom was trying to kill Janneken Gist. Therefore, he went to help and stabbed Janneken to death with his knife. The other 2 women were killed by Zeevank. Meanwhile, Van Welderen and Beer and some other mutineers had crept into the tents. The cabin boys were sleeping. The men bludgeoned and stabbed 8 of them to death where they lay. Those who were wounded were dragged to the sea to drown. 3 boys got away. They were safe. For now. Maiken Cardous's baby cried a lot. The mother was dehydrated and wasn't producing enough milk. Hieronymus invited the exhausted mother to his tent and was all sympathy and love. Why was her baby wailing so? Maiken was relieved to find the undermerchant kind and reassuring. She told him the baby had perhaps some intestinal problems. Hieronymus figured as much, and Ever the apothecary told her he had just the cure for that. He gave the baby medicine and it stopped crying immediately. Maiken was thankful, but then the child turned grey and it had trouble breathing. Hieronymus's cure was Mercurium sublimatum, calomel and mercurius chloride, a purge medication, which was lethal in large doses. He'd given the incessant whining nuisance a whopping big dose. It didn't work. The baby slipped into a coma, and Hieronymus noticed it could neither live nor die. Hieronymus sent Maiken away and sicked bloodhound Zeevank and other trusted killers after her to finish the job. He told him to bring another new mutineer along to get his hands dirty, the second most senior VOC officer on Batavia's graveyard, Salomon Deschamps, Pelsart's clerk. On the 20th of July at night, he was fetched out of his tent by Stonecutter, who took him to Maiken Cardous's tent, where David Zeevank, Jan Hendricks and Cornelis Pieters of Utrecht were, who said to him that they were not certain of his faithfulness, and therefore took a young suckling child from the lap of Maiken Cardous, and said to him, "Deschamps, here is a half-dead child. You're not a fighting man. Here is a little noose. Go over there and fix it, so that we here on the island do not hear so much wailing." Then he, without protest, has taken the child outside the tent and has strangled it, an act of very evil consequence. The baby was the 105th person to die at the undermerchant's command. By now, fewer than 60 people were alive on Batavia's graveyard. Hieronymus was close to his objective: to have murdered or destroyed all the people until the amount of 45 or less. Back at VOCHQ, the high boatswain of the Batavia, Jan Everts, had initially been sentenced for the assault and abuse of a married woman and was to be flogged, branded, and put in chains for 6 months. But Koen and the council thought it over. They decided that the crime was so inhuman and of such evil consequence that he should be made as an example for others. For the protection of all honest women, they considered it just and fair that he was put to death. A set of permanent gallows stood left of the citadel on a field where many people could gather to watch the executions. Evert, bound, manacled, and severely beaten, was dragged to the field by 2 guards. All those gathered knew what Evert had done. The story of the Batavia had spread like wildfire. As Evert stood on the ladder with the noose tied around his neck, he murmured no prayers. The ladder was kicked away. Evert dropped and gave a few kicks before he died. His body wasn't cut down but left to be eaten by birds of prey until he was nothing more than a shriveled corpse, a warning to all. This is what happened if you broke VOC rules, Dutch law, or both. Captain Adriaan Jacobs remained still imprisoned for the grave error of having lost a ship on his watch, waiting for the judgment of the 17 company board members. The under-merchant had big plans for tonight. He had Van Huysen invite the Reverend to his tent to have dinner with his daughter and gave him the supplies to prepare a lavish meal. Hieronymus and Lucretia joined them. The Reverend was grateful for the time with his daughter. They'd only been able to talk briefly, and only when Van Huysen was out on a mission. The Reverend told his wife Maria that God had answered their prayers. He would now be able to convince Hieronymus to end the violence. At about 8 o'clock in the evening, the wine kept flowing, and the Reverend was trying to engage Hieronymus in a more serious conversation. The under-merchant wasn't taking the bait. Meanwhile, the Reverend's wife and their 6 other children were in their tent. Mom was preparing a pot of sea lion stew when Zeevank called the family servant Wijbrecht Klaas to come outside. Maria and Wijbrecht looked at each other. Had Hieronymus changed his mind, and was he inviting them over to join the Reverend at dinner? Wijbrecht left the tent to find out, and walked straight into Jan Hendriks's knife. Moments later, she dropped dead at Zeevank's feet. Zeevank now entered the tent. Hendriks, Michels, Beer, Cornelis Pieters, Stonecutter, and soldier Wouter Loos followed him in. Andries Liebent and Andries Jonas stood watch to make sure no one escaped, or so they claimed. 7 family members faced 7 mutineers. Zeevank spoke. Here has been reported hidden goods of the company that we will search for, and we will get them. During his talking, the lamp has been blown out. The mutineers never even made an attempt to search the place. As Zeevank blew out the lantern and put out the light, each of his men put out the light. Leonard Michels hit Maria's head with several blows of an axe. Beer killed 14-year-old Willemijntgien with an axe. The eldest son, a VOC assistant, the 24-year-old Bastiaan, tried to counterattack. Wouter Loos pushed him back and has beaten the eldest son underfoot with an adze until he was dead. Zeevank killed 19-year-old Pieter. Leonard killed 13-year-old Johannes. Beer killed 11-year-old Agnete. Beer tried to grab 8-year-old Roeland, but the kid ducked between his legs. Beer feared that if he turned around and swung at the boy in the dark, he might hit one of his buddies. But Zeevank and Cornelis Pieters stood close behind him, and one or the other killed the boy with a hatchet. Except Maria was not then quite dead. Beer bent over her as she lay on the ground and finished her off. It was over. The family, save for Judith and the Reverend, was wiped out. The bodies were quickly buried in a large pit dug especially for them earlier that day. The mutineers' thirst for blood had not been sated. The group split up, looking to do more damage. Jan Hendriks hadn't had his fill, and coaxed Hendrik de Nijs, a minor VOC functionary with no valuable skills, out of his tent. Come out. Because he would not come out for fear, they dragged and tore him outside, and Jan Hendriks battered his head in with an adze, so that he died immediately. We're not done. Zeevank summoned Andries Jonas, who hadn't killed anyone that night, and sent him to Maiken Cardous's tent. Her baby's crying was over, but now she was wailing. Take care of it. Andries Jonas stood outside her tent. Maiken, come, we're gonna go for a walk. Andries, are you going to hurt me as well? No, not at all. Maiken appeared and started walking. Andries grabbed her and threw her to the ground. He tried to stab her, but she was fighting back hard. She grabbed a knife, which then got stuck in her hand, and Andries couldn't pull it out. He then tried to strangle her, but she kept fighting. Wouter Loos was walking with Zeevank, and they saw what was happening. Loos ran to Andries' aid and killed the woman with his axe. Maiken was gone, only a day after her baby was murdered. They threw her in the large family pit. They were still not done. Back at Mutineer headquarters, Zeevank summoned Allard Jans, who hadn't killed that night either. He and Cornelis Pieters had to get rid of Aris Jans, the surgeon. Following standard operating procedure, Allard stood outside Aris' tent. "Aris, come. We have to go and search for birds for the merchant." Aris was wary. He knew what this meant, but there was no use in staying inside. If he was done for, he was done for. It was still possible they were going bird hunting that night. That's when the birds were on their nests and easiest to catch. When they reached the bird's nest section of Batavia's graveyard, Allard struck Aris on the shoulder from behind with his sword. He didn't cut very deep. Aris dropped and rolled away. Cornelis Pieters swung his sword at Aris' head, but his sword was also blunt. The surgeon was injured, but not fatally. He took off and dove into the water. Allard and Pieters chased him, but the splashing stopped. It was too dark to see. Where was he? Was he dead? They waited for a while, their ears tuned for any sound, but all remained quiet. Aris was still out there, but because he had been lying flat on his stomach, they could not see him. So they said to one another, turning back, "He's had it," for they thought he was so wounded that he must die. Shocked and bleeding somewhat, Aris was a marked man. He couldn't stay on the island where 35 people were trying to kill him. He slowly swam around to the beach and very quietly dragged a newly built yawl out to the shallows and into the deep. It had been under strict guard on the island side, but nobody expected a thief to come from the water. Surgeon Aris Jans safely made it to Hayes Island the next morning. Now Team Hayes had a boat.